The rain fell in thick, heavy sheets, turning the dirt of Blackwood Cemetery into a slick, black mud that clung to Ellis's boots like cold, dead fingers. He'd been digging graves in this forgotten corner of Louisiana for over 30 years, and he knew every inch of the land, the way the old oak trees groaned in the wind, the way the mist curled over the tombstones at dawn, the way the earth sometimes seemed to breathe beneath his feet. But tonight, something was different. Ellis wiped the rain from his face and leaned on his shovel, staring down at the freshly covered grave of Eleanor Villette. The funeral had been delayed by the storm, and by the time they lowered her coffin, the sky had opened up in fury. The mourners had fled, leaving Ellis to finish the job alone. He didn't mind. He preferred the quiet company of the dead over the uneasy whispers of the living. He was about to turn away when he heard it, a dull thump from beneath the earth. Ellis froze. The sound was soft, muffled by layers of wet soil, but unmistakable. A knock, just the rain, he muttered, forcing a dry laugh. Or a damn gopher, but his hands tightened around the shovel. Then it came again. Knock, knock, knock. Louder this time. Rhythmic. His breath caught in his throat. The sound wasn't coming from the trees or the wind. It was coming from inside the grave. Ellis stumbled back, his boots slipping in the mud. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped thing. He told himself it was the soil settling, the wood of the coffin shifting under the weight of the earth. But then, knock, knock, knock. 3 sharp, deliberate raps. Then silence. Ellis's blood turned to ice. He had heard stories, of course, whispers among gravediggers about bodies that twitched in their coffins, about muffled screams from 6 feet under. But he had never believed them. Not until now. The rain poured harder, blurring his vision. He should leave, run. But something, some dark, gnawing curiosity, rooted him to the spot. "Ain't no way," he whispered. Then, as if in answer, the knocking started again. Faster, desperate. And this time, it didn't stop. Ellis stood there, rain streaming down his face, his clothes soaked through, his hands shaking so badly he could barely grip the shovel. The knocking had stopped again, but the silence was worse, thick and heavy like the air before a lightning strike. His mind raced with explanations. An animal trapped in the grave, a tree root shifting, some trick of the wind. But deep down, in that primal part of the brain that knows true fear, he knew it wasn't any of those things. The sound had been too deliberate, too human. Swallowing hard, he forced himself to step closer to the grave, his boots sinking into the mud as if the earth itself was trying to pull him down. He told himself he'd just take one look, just enough to prove to himself that it was nothing, that his mind was playing tricks on him after too many years in this God-forsaken place. But as he stared at the freshly turned soil, his breath coming in ragged gasps, he realized there was no going back, not after what he'd heard. With a grunt, he drove the shovel into the wet earth and began to dig. Every scoop of mud felt like a betrayal, like he was disturbing something that should never be disturbed. The rain made the work harder, the dirt sliding back into the hole almost as fast as he could remove it. His arms burned, his back ached, but he couldn't stop now. The deeper he went, the stronger the smell became. Not the usual damp earth and decay of a fresh grave, but something sharper, something wrong. It was the metallic tang of fear sweat, the sourness of bile, the stench of something that had struggled. His stomach twisted, but he kept digging. His movements frantic now, the shovel striking wood far sooner than it should have. The coffin. Ellis dropped to his knees, clawing at the dirt with his bare hands, his nails splitting against the rough wood. He found the lid, slick with rain and mud, and hesitated. What if he was wrong? What if it was just his imagination? But then he remembered the knocking. 3 slow, deliberate strikes like someone begging to be let out. Gritting his teeth, he wedged the shovel under the lid and pushed. The wood groaned, then gave way with a sickening crack. The smell hit him first. Thick, cloying, the stench of a body that had rotted too fast. Ellis gagged, covering his mouth with his sleeve, but it was too late. His eyes watered as he forced himself to look inside. The corpse of Eleanor Villette lay there, her burial dress torn, her fingers bent at unnatural angles, the tips raw and bloody. But it wasn't the state of her body that made Ellis's blood freeze. It was her face. Her eyes were wide open, her mouth stretched in a silent scream, her skin mottled with burst blood vessels. And then he saw the lid. Deep, ragged grooves ran across the inside of the coffin. Claw marks. She had tried to scratch her way out, but the worst part was the words carved into the wood, jagged and uneven, as if written in a frenzy. I was still breathing. Ellis stumbled back, his heart slamming against his ribs. He wanted to run, to scream, to pretend he'd never seen any of this, but then his eyes fell on Eleanor's hand. Clutched in her stiff fingers was a small, crumpled piece of paper. He reached for it, his hands trembling so badly he could barely unfold it. The message inside was only 2 words. Your turn. Ellis's breath came in ragged, panicked bursts as he stared at the note, the words searing into his mind like a brand. Your turn. His hands shook so violently the paper slipped from his fingers, swallowed by the mud at the bottom of the grave. The rain hammered down, mixing with the cold sweat on his face, but he barely noticed. His entire body felt numb, his thoughts spiraling into a dark, suffocating dread. He had seen death in every form, accidents, sickness, violence, but nothing like this. Nothing that looked so much like terror. Eleanor Villette hadn't just died in that coffin. She had fought. A gust of wind howled through the cemetery, rattling, the branches of the old oaks like skeletal fingers. Ellis flinched, his head snapping up. For a second, he thought he saw something. A shadow moving between the graves, too tall to be a man, too still to be the wind. He blinked, and it was gone. His pulse roared in his ears. He needed to get out of here. Now. With one last horrified glance at the ruined coffin, he scrambled out of the grave, his boots slipping in the mud. He didn't bother filling it back in. He didn't even grab his shovel. He just ran, his legs burning, his lungs on fire, the trees blurring past him. As he fled toward the cemetery gates, the night seemed alive around him, whispering, watching. Branches snagged at his clothes like grasping hands. More than once he swore he heard footsteps behind him. Slow, deliberate, keeping pace. But every time he turned, there was nothing. Just the endless rows of tombstones, their inscriptions worn smooth by time, their edges jagged like broken teeth. By the time he reached his truck, his keys were slick with rain. He fumbled with the lock, his breath coming in sharp, panicked, gasps. The engine sputtered to life and he didn't wait for the heater to kick in. He slammed the gear shift into drive and peeled out, the tires throwing up mud and gravel. The road out of Blackwood Cemetery was narrow, hemmed in by swamp water on both sides, the black water shimmering under the storm-lit sky. Ellis gripped, the wheel so tight his knuckles turned white. His reflection in the rearview mirror was pale, his eyes wild. He couldn't stop seeing Eleanor's face, those wide, staring eyes, the way her mouth had been frozen open as if she had died screaming. Then, in the mirror, he saw it, a figure, standing in the middle of the road behind him. Tall. Too tall. Its arms hung limp at its sides, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. And even as the truck sped away, the thing didn't move. It just watched. Ellis jerked the wheel, his heart lurching, into his throat. The truck skidded, tires screeching, and for one terrible second, he thought he was going to plunge into the swamp. But then the vehicle righted itself, and he didn't dare look back. He just drove, faster and faster, until the cemetery disappeared into the storm behind him. He didn't stop until he reached his small, run-down house on the edge of town. Inside, he locked the door, drew every curtain, and poured himself a drink with hands that still wouldn't stop shaking. That night, he dreamed of knocking. 3 slow, deliberate raps against wood. And when he woke, gasping, his sheets drenched. In sweat, he realized. It hadn't come from the dream. It had come from under the bed. The knocking stopped the moment Ellis bolted upright, his heart pounding so hard it felt like it might crack his ribs. He stared into the darkness, ears straining, sweat dripping down his temples. The silence was worse than the sound. Thick and heavy, pressing against him like a physical weight. He told himself it was just the house settling, the old pipes groaning, his mind playing tricks after the horrors of the night. But then he heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. Not under the bed this time, but from the closet. Slow, deliberate, the same rhythm as before. His breath hitched. He wanted to scream, to run, but his body refused to move, frozen in primal terror. The air in the room turned icy, his exhales coming out in visible puffs despite the humid Louisiana night. Something was in here with him. Something that had followed him home. With a choked gasp, he finally forced himself to move, scrambling backward until his spine hit the headboard. His fingers fumbled for the lamp on his nightstand, knocking over a half-empty whiskey glass in his haste. The light flickered on, casting long, wavering shadows across the room. The closet door was slightly ajar. Had he left it like that? He couldn't remember. Then, a sound that made his blood turn to ice. A long, slow scratch against the inside of the closet door. Ellis's throat closed up. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. All he could do was stare as the door creaked open another inch, revealing nothing but darkness inside. And then, a hand, pale, slick with grave dirt, fingers curling around the edge of the door, dragging it open further. Ellis didn't wait to see what came next. He lunged from the bed, crashing into the hallway, his bare feet slapping against the worn wooden floors as he fled toward the front door. He didn't grab shoes, didn't grab his keys. He just ran, bursting out into the storm-lashed night, the rain instantly soaking through his clothes. He didn't stop until he reached his truck, throwing himself inside and locking the doors with trembling hands. His breath came in ragged, panicked gasps as he stared back at his house, half expecting to see something. Someone, standing in the doorway, watching him. But there was nothing. Just the empty porch, the swaying trees, the endless drumming of the rain. Ellis squeezed his eyes shut, gripping the steering wheel until his fingers ached. He needed to think, needed to figure out what the hell was happening. But his mind kept circling back to Eleanor's coffin, to those words carved into the wood. I was still breathing. And then, the note. Your turn. A fresh wave of terror crashed over him. Was this some kind of curse? A warning? Or was he losing? His mind, he didn't know. But he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't go back in that house. With a shaky hand, he turned the ignition and pulled away from the curb, the truck's headlights cutting through the downpour. He didn't have a destination in mind. He just needed to move. But as he drove, his eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, and his blood turned to ice. There, sitting in the back seat, was a figure, pale, dripping wet. Its head tilted slowly toward him, lips parting in a grotesque smile. "You can't run forever, gravedigger," Ellis screamed, a raw, guttural sound that tore through the cab of the truck and jerked the wheel hard to the right. The tires screeched against the wet asphalt as the vehicle fishtailed, spinning out of control before slamming into a ditch with a bone-jarring crunch. His head snapped forward, cracking against the steering wheel, and for a moment, everything went black. When his vision cleared, his ears were ringing. His mouth tasted like copper, and the rain was coming down harder than ever, drumming against the roof like impatient fingers. He didn't want to look. He had to look. Gritting his teeth, he forced his head to turn, his breath coming in shallow, panicked hitches as his eyes scanned the back seat. Empty. No pale figure. No dripping water. No grinning corpse whispering threats. Just the torn upholstery and the faint smell of mildew. Ellis let out a shuddering breath, pressing his forehead against the steering wheel. He was losing it. That was the only explanation. The horrors of the night had finally pushed him over the edge. He needed help. A doctor. A priest. Someone. With a groan, he shoved the door open and stumbled out into the storm, his legs unsteady beneath him. The truck was lodged deep in the ditch, the front bumper crumpled against a gnarled cypress tree. He was miles from town, the road barely visible through the sheets of rain. No streetlights, no houses, just the endless swamp stretching out on either side, the black water shimmering with each lightning strike. Then, a sound cut through the storm, a low, wet gurgle, like someone choking on mud. Ellis went rigid. It was coming from the ditch. His stomach twisted as he forced himself to peer over the edge, his pulse roaring in his ears. The rainwater had pooled at the bottom, swirling with dirt and dead leaves. And there, half submerged in the muck, was a hand, pale, skeletal. Its fingers twitched. Ellis recoiled, his boots slipping in the mud as he scrambled backward. No, 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 no. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening. But even as he watched, the hand flexed, its bony digits clawing at the earth, dragging something up from the depths of the ditch. A skull breached the surface, its hollow eye sockets staring directly at him, its jaw unhinged. And then it spoke. "You buried us too soon, gravedigger." The voice wasn't human. It was a chorus of whispers, 100 dead throats gasping at once. Ellis's legs gave out and he collapsed to his knees, his entire body trembling. Around him, the swamp seemed to move. Shapes rising from the water, skeletal hands breaking the surface, eyeless faces turning toward him. They were everywhere, and they were closer. The skull in the ditch let out a rattling laugh, its teeth clacking together like dice. "Now it's your turn." Ellis didn't think. He just ran. He didn't look back, but he could feel them following. The rain had turned the dirt roads into rivers of mud. Each step, Ellis took a struggle against the sucking earth that seemed determined to drag him down. His lungs burned, his legs screamed in protest, but he didn't dare stop. Not when the whispers followed him, slithering through the trees like serpents made of shadow. Branches lashed at his face, drawing blood, but he barely felt it. The only thing that mattered was distance. Getting away from them. He didn't know how long he ran before he saw the lights. A small gas station, its neon sign flickering weakly in the storm. A lone beacon in the drowning dark. Ellis sobbed in relief, his legs giving out as he stumbled into the parking lot, his hands slapping against the glass door before he realized it was locked. The place was closed. Inside, the fluorescent lights hummed, illuminating empty aisles, and a cash register left open, abandoned in a hurry. Ellis pounded on the door, his voice breaking as he screamed for help, but no one came. Then, behind him, a sound, a slow, wet dragging. He didn't want to turn around. He had to turn around. There, at the edge of the parking lot, stood a figure. Not skeletal, not rotting. Eleanor Villette. Her burial dress clung to her waterlogged skin, her hair stringy with grave dirt, her lips blue and parted in a smile that showed too many teeth. She took a step forward, her bare feet leaving prints of black mud. "You should have dug deeper, Ellis." Ellis backed up until his spine hit the glass, his breath coming in ragged, panicked gasps. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. But the smell. God, the smell. Wet earth and spoiled meat and something sweetly rotten. It filled his nose, his mouth, his lungs. Eleanor tilted her head, her neck cracking audibly. You hear them now, don't you? And then Ellis realized the whispers weren't coming from the trees. They were coming from underground. Beneath the gas station's concrete, beneath the roads, beneath the entire godforsaken town, they were there. The ones buried too soon. The ones who woke up in the dark, and they were hungry. Eleanor's grin widened. They've been waiting for you. Ellis turned and ran again, his vision blurring with tears. He didn't know where he was going. He just knew he had to get away. But the town had other plans. The streetlights flickered as he passed, each one dying as he neared, plunging him into darkness. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they weren't whispers at all. They were screams. And then, in the middle of the road, he saw it. A gravestone. Freshly carved. His name on it. Ellis staggered to a stop, his breath hitching. The date, etched below his name, wasn't next week, wasn't tomorrow. It was today. Behind him, the dragging sound grew closer, and then a cold hand closed around his ankle. Ellis looked down, his scream trapped in his throat like a living thing. The hand gripping his ankle was bone white, fingers too long, nails blackened and split from clawing at coffin lids. The ground beneath him had turned soft, hungry. The asphalt cracking as something beneath it pushed upward. First one skeletal arm, then another, breaking through the surface like drowning men desperate for air. The whispers were deafening now. A chorus of the wrongfully buried, their voices thick with soil and decay. You left us in the dark, they moaned. You filled our graves too fast. Now we'll fill yours slow. Ellis tried to pull free, but the hands were everywhere, bursting from the road, the sidewalk, the walls of nearby buildings, all grasping, all pulling. He thrashed, his muscles burning, his pulse a frantic drumbeat in his ears. But it was no use. The earth beneath him opened up, a yawning mouth of damp soil and tangled roots, and he fell. Down, down, into the dark. The last thing he saw before the dirt closed over him was Eleanor's face, her hollow eyes gleaming with something like pity as she leaned over the grave. "Don't worry," she whispered. "You'll wake up soon." Then the first shovelful of earth hit the coffin lid. Ellis screamed, but no one heard him. Epilogue: The New Gravedigger. A year later, a man named Harlan took over at Blackwood Cemetery. The pay was decent, the work was quiet, and the previous caretaker had left behind a perfectly good shovel. On his first night, as he finished burying a suicide case near the old oak tree, he heard a sound. 3 soft knocks from underground. Harlan laughed, wiping sweat from his brow. Damn gophers! And when the knocking came again, louder this time, he didn't hesitate. He started digging. The cemetery was always quiet after midnight, but never completely silent. The wind carried whispers through the rows of headstones, and the rustling of leaves sounded like footsteps following too close behind. Jacob had worked as the night watchman at Blackwood Cemetery for 3 years, and he'd grown used to the unease that clung to the air like the thick fog that rolled in from the woods. But tonight was different. Tonight the silence felt heavier, as if the graves themselves were holding their breath. Jacob wasn't supposed to dig graves. That was Old Man Harker's job, but when Harker called in sick, the manager had shrugged and tossed Jacob a shovel. Just till sunrise, he'd said, as if digging up the earth where the dead slept was as simple as sweeping a floor. Jacob didn't argue. The pay was good, and he needed it. But as he patrolled the children's section, a part of him wished he'd refused. There was something about the small, crooked headstones that made his skin crawl. Maybe it was the way the moonlight made the tiny angels' faces look like they were crying. Or maybe it was the way his flashlight beam seemed to shrink, as if the darkness here was thicker, hungrier. He checked his watch. 3 a.m. The witching hour, some called it. That's when he heard it. A soft, broken sound, like a child trying to muffle their tears. His breath hitched. The sobbing was faint, but unmistakable. It came from somewhere ahead, near the old willow tree where the ground was always damp, no matter how hot the summer. Jacob's grip tightened on his flashlight. It's just the wind, he told himself. But the wind didn't sob. The wind didn't sound alive. Against his better judgment, he followed the sound. Each step made the hairs on his neck rise. The beam of his flashlight trembled as it cut through the fog, revealing glimpses of names and dates on the graves. Beloved daughter. Taken too soon, little lamb. Then he saw her, a small figure in a white dress crouched beside a weathered headstone. Her shoulders shook with silent cries, her hair hanging in tangled strands. Jacob's throat went dry. No one should be here. Not at this hour. Not in this part of the cemetery. "Hey," he called softly, his voice barely louder than the rustling leaves. "You okay?" The girl didn't move, didn't turn. The sobbing stopped, but the air grew colder, sharp enough to sting his lungs. Jacob took another step, his boot sinking into the wet earth. The flashlight flickered, once, twice, and for a heartbeat, the world went dark. When the light returned, the girl was gone, vanished. No footprints, no sound, just an empty space where she'd been. Jacob's pulse roared in his ears. He swung the light wildly, searching for any sign of her. That's when he saw it. A photograph, lying face down on the grave. His hands shook as he picked it up. The paper was damp, as if it had been left out in the rain. He turned it over. 2 children stared back at him. Twins, dressed in matching outfits. A boy and a girl. Their faces were eerily familiar. Too familiar. Because one of them was him. Jacob's blood turned to ice. Jacob's fingers trembled as he stared at the photograph. The boy in the picture was unmistakably him. Same round cheeks, same wide, curious eyes. But he had no memory of ever wearing that stiff-collared shirt. No recollection of standing beside a sister he never knew he had. The girl beside him was a stranger, yet her face carried an unsettling familiarity, like a name he couldn't quite recall. Her smile was too wide, her eyes too knowing, as if she were staring right through the photo and into his soul. The back of the photograph bore those 5 words, scribbled in a child's uneven hand. "I miss you, brother." A gust of wind howled through the cemetery, snatching the breath from Jacob's lungs. The flashlight flickered again, and for a moment the shadows around him seemed to shift, stretching, reaching. He stumbled back, nearly tripping over a sunken grave. His mind raced. Was this some kind of sick joke? Had someone planted this here to mess with him? But who would even know? Who would care enough to dig up a past he didn't even know existed? He needed answers. Now, Jacob shoved the photo into his pocket and bolted for the caretaker's shed, his boots splashing through puddles of mist. The door creaked open, and the stale smell of old tools and damp wood hit him. He fumbled for his phone, hands shaking so badly he nearly dropped it. His mother would know. She had to know. The phone rang, and rang, and rang. Just as he was about to hang up, a groggy voice answered. "Jacob, do you know what time it is?" "Mom," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Did I have a sister?" Silence. Thick, heavy, suffocating. Then a sharp intake of breath. "Who told you that?" His stomach dropped. That wasn't a denial. "Mom, tell me." A sigh, ragged and tired, like she'd been carrying this weight for decades. "You were twins," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "She didn't make it. Not even a day. We never told you because, well, it was easier that way." Jacob's knees buckled. He gripped the edge of the workbench to keep from collapsing. "Her name," he demanded. What was her name? Another pause. Then, softer, as if afraid to wake the dead. "Lily." The moment the name left her lips, the shed's single light bulb exploded in a shower of sparks. Jacob yelped, plunging the room into darkness. Outside, the wind shrieked like a child's wail. His phone slipped from his fingers, clattering to the floor, and then, from somewhere impossibly close, a little girl's voice whispered, "You remembered." Jacob's entire body locked in place, his breath coming in shallow, panicked gasps, as the voice, so small, so close, echoed in the darkness around him. The air in the shed had turned frigid, his exhales forming ghostly clouds in front of his face, and though he couldn't see anything in the pitch black, he could feel something, standing right beside him, its presence like a physical weight pressing against his skin. His fingers scrambled across the rough wood of the workbench, searching for anything, a tool, a lighter, anything, to defend himself, but his hands only met dust and cobwebs. The voice had come from no more than a foot away, yet when he strained, his ears, there was no sound of breathing, no rustle of movement, just that awful, suffocating silence that followed its words. You remembered. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. His mother's frantic voice crackled from the phone on the floor, her words distant and warped as if the call were breaking up, though he knew the signal in the cemetery was always strong. Jacob, what's happening? Talk to me. He wanted to reach for it, to scream for help, but his muscles refused to obey, locked in place by a terror so deep it felt like his very bones had turned to ice. Then, slowly, impossibly, a faint glow began to seep into the room, not from a light source but from the photograph in his pocket, its edges emitting a sickly, greenish luminescence that pulsed like a slow, steady heartbeat. He could feel it, burning through the fabric of his pants, searing his thigh, and with a choked gasp, he finally wrenched his arm free and yanked it out, desperate to throw it away. But the moment his fingers touched the image, his vision split. Flashes of a memory that wasn't his own surged through his mind. A hospital room, his mother weeping, a tiny, lifeless bundle in a bassinet beside him. And then, worse, the sensation of small, icy fingers closing around his wrist. He screamed, thrashing backward so hard he toppled a shelf, sending rusted tools clattering to the ground. The glow from the photograph vanished as suddenly as it had appeared, plunging him back into darkness, but the feeling of those fingers lingered, their grip bruisingly cold. His pulse roared in his ears, his entire body trembling as he crab-walked backward until his spine hit the wall. The shed door, which he knew he had shut behind him, now stood slightly ajar, a sliver of moonlight cutting through the gap. And there, just beyond the threshold, stood the silhouette of a little girl, her back to him, her tangled hair swaying slightly in a wind that didn't exist inside the shed. Jacob's voice was a ragged whisper. Lily? The figure didn't turn, but her head tilted just slightly as if considering him. Then, with a sound like dry leaves scraping against stone, she spoke again. You left me alone. Before he could respond, the door slammed shut with a force that shook the walls, and the photograph in his hand moved. The image of the twins twisting, warping, the ink running like tears as Lily's face in the picture turned toward him. Her hollow eyes locking onto his. The last thing he saw before his vision went black was her smile stretching, widening, far too many teeth filling a mouth that split her face from cheek to cheek. Jacob woke with a jolt, his face pressed against the damp earth of the cemetery, the taste of soil thick on his tongue. His head throbbed as if split open, his muscles screaming in protest as he pushed himself up onto his elbows. The shed door stood wide open, the first pale hints of dawn bleeding into the sky, but the world around him felt wrong. Too still, too silent, the air thick with the metallic tang of something rotting. He didn't remember collapsing, didn't remember leaving the shed at all. But his clothes were caked in mud, his fingernails torn and bloody, as if he'd been clawing at the ground. And then he saw it. The grave in front of him was fresh. Not, one of the neat, orderly plots dug by professionals. This was ragged, uneven, the dirt piled haphazardly to the side like something had burrowed its way out. The headstone was cracked down the middle, the name weathered to near illegibility, but he didn't need to read it to know. This was her grave. Lily's. His flashlight lay abandoned nearby, its beam illuminating a single, horrifying detail. Tiny handprints pressed into the mud at the edge of the hole, as if a child had pulled herself free. A choked sound escaped him, half sob, half disbelieving laugh. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening, yet the evidence was right in front of him. The disturbed earth, the photograph still clutched in his fist, though now the image was different. The twins' faces blurred, their features melting, together in a grotesque mimicry of life, the undeniable, gut-churning certainty that something had followed him out of that shed. He staggered to his feet, his legs threatening to give way beneath him, and turned toward the cemetery gates. He had to get out. Now. But the path back was gone. Where there should have been rows of headstones leading to the main road, there was only a thick, swirling fog, so dense it seemed to swallow the light whole, and standing at the edge of it, barely visible in the gloom, was Lily. She was closer this time, close enough to see the way her dress hung off her emaciated frame, the way her skin stretched too tight over her bones, gray and mottled like old parchment. Her head was tilted again, that same unnatural angle, but now her eyes were fixed on him, black and depthless, reflecting nothing. "You shouldn't have forgotten me," she whispered, though her lips never moved. Jacob's breath came in ragged gasps. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but his feet were rooted to the spot, the ground beneath him shifting subtly, as if something beneath the soil were stirring. The fog crept closer, tendrils of it wrapping around his ankles like skeletal fingers. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled, a deep, mournful sound that didn't belong in this place at this hour. And then, from every grave around him, came the sound of scraping. Slow at first, then louder, more frantic. The earth breathed, rising and falling in time with the bell's toll, and Jacob realized with dawning horror that the graves weren't empty anymore, that the things inside them were waking up. Lily smiled. "They've been waiting for you, brother." The ground beneath Jacob's feet began to tremble, a low, guttural groaning rising from the earth as if the cemetery itself were in pain. The scraping grew louder, not just from one grave now, but from dozens, a chorus of nails dragging against wood, of dirt shifting as something beneath fought its way to the surface. Jacob's heart hammered against his ribs, his breath coming in short, panicked bursts as he stumbled backward, his boots sinking into the suddenly soft earth. The fog thickened around him, curling around his arms like a lover's embrace, cold and suffocating. Lily hadn't moved, but her smile widened, her jagged teeth gleaming in the dim light. Then the first hand broke through, a skeletal finger, then another, clawing at the dirt, grasping for purchase. The headstone nearest to Jacob toppled with a crash as something beneath it heaved, the soil erupting in a shower of damp earth. A figure lurched upward, a corpse, its flesh sunken and green-tinged, its hollow eye sockets fixed on him with a hunger that made his stomach twist. Its jaw hung slack, a low, wet gurgle bubbling from its throat as it dragged itself forward. Jacob's paralysis shattered. He ran. Branches lashed at his face as he crashed through the cemetery, his lungs burning, his vision blurred with terror. Behind him, the sounds of the dead rising grew louder, the wet thud of bodies pulling themselves free, the creak of rotting joints, the ghastly, breathless moans that filled the air like a twisted hymn. He didn't dare look back, didn't dare stop. The gates had to be close. They had to be, but the fog twisted the paths, turning familiar rows of graves into a labyrinth of shadows and grasping hands. A child's laughter rang out, high and bright, cutting through the groans of the dead. "You can't leave, Jacob." Lily's voice was everywhere, echoing from the trees, the stones, the very air itself. "You belong here. With me." Something snagged his ankle. A skeletal hand, bursting from the ground beneath him. He fell hard, his chin slamming against the earth, his teeth slicing into his tongue. The taste of copper flooded his mouth as he kicked wildly, his boot connecting with something brittle. The hand shattered, but another took its place. Then, another, fingers like iron bands closing around his legs, his arms dragging him down. The last thing he saw before the earth swallowed him whole was Lily, standing over him, her rotting hand outstretched. Welcome home. The earth closed over Jacob's head like a coffin lid, thick clumps of soil forcing their way into his nose, his mouth, his ears, choking him, burying him alive in a suffocating embrace of damp, rotting earth. He thrashed wildly, his muscles, screaming as he fought against the weight pressing down on him from all sides, but the more he struggled, the tighter the unseen hands gripped him, pulling him deeper into the abyss. His lungs burned, his vision exploding in bursts of red and black as his body convulsed from lack of air, and just when he thought his ribs would collapse under the pressure, the ground beneath him gave way. He was falling, tumbling through, empty, endless darkness, the air around him thick with the stench of decay and something older, something hungry. He hit the ground with a bone-jarring thud, his body rolling across cold, wet stone, his gasps echoing in a vast, hollow space that shouldn't exist beneath the cemetery. When his vision cleared, he wished it hadn't. He was in a cavern. No, a tunnel, its walls lined with crumbling bones stacked like firewood, their hollow eye sockets watching him as he staggered to his feet. The ceiling dripped with something thick and dark, the droplets hissing as they hit the ground, eating into the stone like acid. The air was alive with whispers, voices overlapping in a language he couldn't understand, their words slithering into his mind like worms burrowing into soft flesh. And at the far end of the tunnel, barely visible in the flickering glow of corpse light that clung to the walls, stood Lily. But she wasn't alone. Shapes moved in the shadows behind her, twisted, malformed things that might have once been human, their limbs too long, their mouths too wide, their bodies stitched together from the remains of the dead. They swayed like reeds in a breeze, their hollow groans harmonizing with the whispers in the walls, their hollow eyes fixed on Jacob with a terrible, knowing hunger. Lily stepped forward, her bare feet leaving no prints in the thick layer of dust that coated the ground, her smile stretching wider than any human mouth should allow. "You see now, don't you?" she murmured, her voice no longer that of a child, but something ancient, something wrong. "You were always meant to be here, with us, with me." Jacob's legs gave out, his knees hitting the stone with a crack that echoed through the tunnel. The photograph, now burned at the edges, the image of the twins fused together into a single monstrous face, slid from his pocket, landing face up at Lily's feet. She picked it up, her fingers leaving blackened smudges on the paper as she traced the outline of their merged faces. "They tried to separate us," she whispered, her voice trembling with a rage that made the walls shudder. "But the dead don't stay buried, Jacob, and neither do we." Behind her, the things in the shadows began to advance. Jacob's scream lodged in his throat like a shard of glass as the figures emerged from the darkness, their bodies a grotesque patchwork of decay, stitched together limbs, faces melted into featureless flesh, mouths unhinging like snakes to release guttural, wet sounds that weren't quite words. The ground beneath him trembled, not from their steps, but from something deeper, something vast and slumbering that had begun to stir. Lily stood at the center of it all, her hollow eyes, reflecting no light, her grin splitting her face into something no longer even pretending to be human. The photograph in her hands blackened at the edges, the faces of the twins now fully merged into a single screaming visage, their mouths open in a silent, eternal wail. They lied to us. Lily whispered, her voice no longer coming from her body, but from the walls, the ceiling, the bones embedded in the earth around them. They buried me alone. They let you forget. But the dead remember everything. The tunnel convulsed, the walls peeling apart like rotten flesh as something enormous shifted in the darkness beyond. A presence so vast it defied shape, a thing of gnashing teeth and unspooling shadows that pulsed like a second heartbeat. Jacob's mind fractured at the edges, his sanity unraveling as the truth crashed over him. This wasn't just a grave, it was a mouth. The entire cemetery, the tunnels, the suffocating earth, all of it was part of something older, something that fed on the forgotten, the unmourned, the twins torn apart by lies. Lily reached for him, her fingers elongating into bone-white talons. "You're mine now," she crooned. "We'll never be apart again." The last thing Jacob saw was the photograph igniting in her hands, the flames licking up to reveal the final truth, the date on the back, written in the same child's hand. It was tomorrow's date, and then the darkness swallowed him whole. The morning groundskeeper found Jacob's flashlight abandoned near an undisturbed grave. The earth packed tight, no sign of digging. But every year, on the same night, the caretakers report the same thing, the sound of a child sobbing near the old willow tree. And if you walk those fog-drenched paths at 3 a.m., you might see it too. A photograph, left on a headstone. Flipping it over reveals two faces, blurred together, their mouths open in a scream. Turn it again. The date is always tomorrow. The cemetery on the outskirts of Prague was a place of silence and shadows, where the dead slept under crooked headstones and the wind carried whispers of forgotten names. Lucas had worked there for 12 years, digging graves, filling them, and tending to the crumbling stones. He knew every inch of the land, the way the mist clung to the oldest tombs at dawn, the way the crows gathered near the unmarked plots. But that morning, as he trudged through the frost-covered grass, something was wrong. Near the far corner, where the graves were so old their names had faded into the earth, there was a fresh hole in the ground. Not a messy, uneven pit, but a perfect rectangle, as if carved by unseen hands. The edges were smooth, the dirt undisturbed except for the gaping darkness below. No burial had been scheduled. No one had been here. Lucas frowned, gripping his shovel tighter. "Kids," he muttered. Teenagers sometimes sneaked in at night, daring each other to touch the oldest graves. But this was no prank. The hole was too precise, too deep. He peered. Inside, nothing but blackness. Shaking his head, he filled it back in, patting the earth flat. The next morning, his boots crunched over frost as he returned to the same spot. His breath caught. The grave was open again. But this time, it was. Twice as deep, the walls were smooth, impossibly straight, as if something had clawed its way out, or dug its way in. A cold sweat prickled Lucas's neck. He crouched, staring into the abyss. The air from the hole was too cold, smelling of wet soil and something else, something rotten and sweet. He ran to his manager, an old man who scoffed at ghost stories. "Probably just animals." The man grunted, barely looking up from his paperwork. "Fill it again. If it happens once more, we'll check the cameras." Lucas obeyed, but his hands shook as he shoveled dirt into the hole. That night, he slept. The image of that perfect, unnatural grave haunted him. And so, on the third night, he returned. With a flashlight in one hand and a rusty iron cross in the other, an old gift from his superstitious grandmother, Lucas stepped into the cemetery. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, and the only sound was the distant hoot of an owl. When he reached the grave, his blood turned to ice. It was open again, but now the darkness inside was thicker, heavier, as if the shadows themselves were alive. The beam of his flashlight trembled in his grip as he aimed it downward, and then he saw it. At the very bottom, half buried in the dirt, was a coffin. The lid was slightly ajar, and inside was himself. Lucas's breath came in ragged gasps as he stared down into the grave, his flashlight shaking violently in his grip. The figure inside the coffin was undeniably him. Same sunken cheeks, same gravedigger's uniform, even the same rusted watch his father had given him years ago. The corpse's skin was waxy and gray, lips slightly parted as if frozen mid-scream, but the worst part was the eyes. They were wide open, glassy, staring straight up at him, not with the dull emptiness of death, but with a terrible awareness, as if the thing in the coffin had been waiting for him. A choked sound escaped Lucas's throat as he stumbled back, his boots kicking loose dirt into the hole, and for a single, heart-stopping second, he thought he saw the corpse's fingers twitch. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement that sent a wave of primal terror through him, the thing's eyelids blinked. A scream tore from Lucas's lungs, raw and guttural, as he scrambled away from the grave, falling onto his back in the damp grass. His flashlight rolled away, casting wild, swinging shadows across the tombstones, and in that chaos of light and darkness, he thought he saw something move down in the pit. A scraping sound, like nails dragging against wood. He didn't wait to see more. He ran, his pulse hammering in his ears, his breath burning in his chest, not stopping until he reached the cemetery gates. He didn't look back. He couldn't. The next morning, Lucas returned with the manager and 2 other workers, his voice trembling as he led them to the spot. But when they arrived, his stomach dropped. The grave was gone. The earth was smooth, untouched, as if it had never been disturbed. No hole, no coffin, no other version of him, staring up from the darkness. The manager gave him a long, pitying look. "Lucas, when was the last time you slept?" Lucas could only shake his head, his mouth dry, his hands still trembling. He knew what he had seen, and worse, he knew, deep in his bones, that it wasn't over. That night, Lucas sat in his small, dimly lit house at the edge of town, a bottle of cheap vodka half empty on the table. He had called in sick, unable to face the cemetery again. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the windows like something trying to get in. He kept seeing it. His own dead face, those unblinking eyes. Was it a warning? A premonition? Or something worse? He took another swig, the alcohol doing little to dull the fear gnawing at his insides. Then, just as he was about to drag himself to bed, his phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. His thumb hovered over the screen before he opened it. There was no text, just a single image. A photo of the empty grave, taken at night, and at the bottom, barely visible in the shadows, was a hand. Pale fingers curled over the edge as if something had just begun to climb out. Lucas's fingers trembled so violently he nearly dropped his phone. The image on the screen was impossible. The grave had been filled in when he left, smooth and undisturbed, but this photo showed it open again, the edges jagged and rough like something had burst out from below, and that hand, pale, skeletal, fingers gripping the dirt, the nails blackened with grave soil. It wasn't human, not entirely. The skin looked stretched too tight, the joints too long, and worst of all, he recognized the watch on its wrist. His watch. The same one he was wearing right now. A strangled noise escaped his throat as he stared, his mind racing. Who sent this? How did they get this photo? His thumb swiped frantically, trying to see if there was more. Another message. A clue, anything. But the screen went black. Then, slowly, new words appeared, typed out one letter at a time, as if someone, or something, was writing to him from the other side. You saw me. Lucas's breath hitched. The phone felt like ice in his hand. Another message appeared. Now I see you. A loud thud came from outside, something heavy hitting the porch. Lucas jerked his head up, his heart slamming against his ribs. Silence. Then another thud, closer this time. Something was out there. Something was coming. His eyes darted. Back to his phone. Another message had appeared. Open the door. His blood turned to sludge in his veins. No, 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 no. This wasn't happening. He wasn't drunk enough for hallucinations, wasn't asleep to dismiss this as a nightmare. This was real. Another thud. This time, right against the front door, the wood groaning under the weight. Lucas stumbled backward, knocking over the vodka bottle which shattered on the floor in a pool of glass and alcohol. The smell burned his nose, sharp and suffocating. His phone buzzed again. He didn't want to look, but he had to. I'm here. The door handle rattled. Lucas bolted. He didn't grab a weapon, didn't think to call for help. He just ran, throwing himself through the back door and into the freezing night. The wind howled around him as he sprinted through the empty streets, his lungs burning, his legs threatening to give out. He didn't stop until he reached the only place he could think of, the cemetery. It was insane. The last place he should go. But where else? The police would laugh at him. His manager already thought he was losing his mind. And that thing, whatever it was, had you followed him home. Maybe it was still there, waiting in his house, sitting at his table, wearing his face. Panting, Lucas collapsed near an old mausoleum, his back pressed against the cold stone. He fumbled for his phone, his fingers numb. No new messages. No. He missed calls. Just the last one, staring back at him. I'm here. A twig snapped nearby. Lucas's head whipped up. The cemetery was never empty at night. Not really. There were always sounds, the rustle of animals in the bushes, the creak of old trees bending in the wind. But now, silence. A thick, suffocating quiet, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Then, footsteps. Slow, deliberate, crunching, over dead leaves, coming closer. He couldn't see anything in the dark, but he could feel it. Something was walking toward him, and it was wearing his skin. The footsteps stopped just beyond the edge of the flashlight's glow, and Lucas felt his stomach twist into knots as the air grew thick with the stench of wet earth and something far worse, the cloying, sweet rot of a long-buried corpse. His breath came in shallow, panicked gasps, his fingers digging into the crumbling stone of the mausoleum behind him as if it could somehow protect him from what was coming. Then a voice cut through the darkness, and the sound of it made his blood freeze in his veins. It was his own voice, but wrong, distorted, as if something had learned to mimic human speech without ever truly understanding it. "Why are you running, Lucas?" It whispered, the words slithering through the night like a snake through dead leaves. "We're the same, you and I." A choked sob escaped Lucas's throat as he pressed himself harder against the mausoleum, his eyes straining, against the blackness, desperate to see but terrified of what he might find. Then, a hand emerged from the shadows, pale, skeletal, the fingers too long and tipped with jagged, broken nails, and his flashlight caught the glint of a familiar watch on its wrist. His watch. The one he was still wearing. The impossible. Reality of it crashed over him like a wave. This thing wasn't just wearing his face. It was him. Or some grotesque, hollowed-out version of him, pulled from the grave before its time. The figure stepped forward, and Lucas's scream died in his throat as the light finally revealed it in full. The thing standing before him was a nightmare mirror image. His own sunken, corpse-pale face stretched into a grin that showed too many teeth, its eyes black pits that reflected no light, its gravedigger's uniform hanging off its emaciated frame like a burial shroud. But the worst part was the way it moved. Jerky, unnatural, as if its bones didn't quite fit together right. It tilted its head, studying him with a predatory curiosity, and when it spoke again, its voice was a guttural rasp. "You saw me down there," it said, taking another step closer. "You looked into my coffin and saw your future." Lucas's legs gave out, and he slid to the ground, his back still pressed against the mausoleum, his whole body shaking. The thing let out a low, rattling laugh that sounded like dirt being shoveled onto a coffin lid. "They'll find you tomorrow," it whispered, leaning down until its rotting breath ghosted over his face. "But it won't be you they bury." Then the flashlight flickered and died. Darkness swallowed them whole. Lucas didn't wait to feel its hands on him. He lunged to the side, scrambling through the dirt and tombstones, his pulse roaring in his ears. Behind him, he heard the thing laugh again, the sound following him like a shadow. He didn't know where he was running. He didn't care. All that mattered was getting away from that thing, that monstrous reflection of himself that had crawled out of the grave. Branches lashed at his face as he crashed through a thicket, the cold air burning his lungs, but he didn't stop. Couldn't stop. Because he could still hear it. The rustle of dead leaves, the soft, wet sound of something moving just out of sight, always getting closer. Then his foot caught on an exposed root, and he went down hard, his face slamming into the dirt. Pain exploded through his jaw, but he barely had time to register it before a hand closed around his ankle. Cold. So cold. Lucas kicked wildly, his scream tearing through the night as he twisted onto his back, expecting to see that grinning, hollow-eyed face looming over him. But there was nothing. Just the empty cemetery. The moon casting long, twisted shadows across the graves. His breath came in ragged, sobbing gasps as he yanked his leg free and scrambled backward, his hands slipping on damp grass. Had he imagined it? Had the fear finally driven him mad? Then he looked down. Wrapped around his ankle, like a grotesque bracelet, was a length of rotten burial shroud. The fabric frayed and stained with grave soil, and clutched in its folds was a single, rusted watch. His watch. But he was still wearing his. Lucas tore the burial shroud from his ankle with a strangled cry, flinging it into the darkness as if it were a venomous snake. His hands shook violently as he stared at the watch still clutched in the rotting fabric, the same make, the same scratches, even the same broken clasp as the one on his wrist. The impossibility of it choked him. How could there be two? And why did the one in the shroud look older, rusted, as if it had been buried for years? His breath came in ragged, panicked bursts as he shoved himself to his feet, his legs threatening to buckle beneath him. The cemetery around him was silent again, the wind dead, the trees still, as though the world itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what he would do next. He couldn't stay here. That thing, that other him, was still out there, lurking in the shadows, watching. But where could he go? Home? No. That thing had already found him there. The police. They'd lock him up for madness before they believed a word of this. His only choice was to run, to get as far from this cursed place as possible. But as he turned to flee, his flashlight beam swept over something that rooted him to the spot. A grave. Freshly dug, unmarked. It sat between two crumbling headstones, the earth dark and loose, as if it had been filled in mere hours ago. And on top of it, placed with deliberate care, was a single object, a grave digger's badge. His badge. Lucas's mouth went dry. He hadn't even realized it was missing. His fingers twitched toward it, some desperate part of him needing to reclaim it, to prove to himself that he was still real, still alive. But another, deeper instinct screamed at him to run. This was a trap, a lure. That thing wanted him to approach, wanted him to see. His pulse pounded in his ears as he took a single, hesitant step forward, the beam of his flashlight trembling over the disturbed soil. Then another step, and another, until he stood at the edge of the grave, staring down at his own badge gleaming in the dim light. His throat tightened. There were handprints in the dirt. Small, desperate, as if someone had tried to claw their way out. A cold sweat broke out across his skin. He had to leave. Now. But just as he turned, a sound froze him in place, a soft, wet shuffling from inside the grave. His breath hitched. No, it wasn't possible. He hadn't heard that. He hadn't. But then it came again. Louder, closer. Something was moving down there. Something was rising. Lucas stumbled back, his boots slipping in the mud, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might burst. The dirt at the center of the grave shifted. Then, with a horrible slithering sound, a hand burst through the surface, skeletal, caked in soil, its fingers twitching like a spider testing the air. Lucas didn't wait to see the rest. He ran. Branches whipped at his face as he crashed. Through the undergrowth, his breath burning in his lungs, his legs screaming in protest. He didn't look back. Couldn't. Because he knew what he would see. That thing, that other Lucas, pulling itself free of the earth, its hollow eyes fixed on him, its mouth stretched into a grin that was all teeth. The trees blurred around him as he ran. The cemetery, gates nowhere in sight, the night swallowing him whole. He didn't know where he was going, didn't care. All that mattered was escape. Then his foot caught on something hidden in the grass, and he went down hard, his face slamming into the dirt. Pain exploded through his skull, stars bursting behind his eyes. Gasping, he rolled onto his back, just in time to see a shadow detach itself from the trees. Tall, thin, wearing his face. It stepped forward, its movements jerky, unnatural, its grin widening as it loomed over him. "You should have stayed in the grave, Lucas," it whispered, its voice a grotesque mimicry of his own. "It's warmer down there." Then the world went black. Lucas awoke to the smell of damp earth and the metallic tang of blood in his mouth. His head throbbed as if split open, his vision swimming in and out of focus as he tried to make sense of where he was. Cold stone pressed against his back. Dim, light filtered through cracks in what appeared to be a mausoleum? He was inside one of the cemetery's oldest tombs, the air thick with decay and something else, something sweetly rotten that made his stomach twist. He tried to move, but his limbs refused to obey, weighed down by a terrifying numbness. Panic surged through him as he realized he'd been positioned, propped against the far wall like a discarded doll, his arms limp at his sides, his legs stretched out before him. And standing over him, silhouetted against the faint moonlight streaming through the half-open door, was Roates, the thing wearing his face. It crouched slowly, its movements all wrong, joints bending in ways they shouldn't, its spine curving like a predator examining prey. Up close, Lucas could see the details of its stolen visage more clearly. The skin sagging slightly as if ill-fitted, the lips too pale, the eyes too black, absorbing the light instead of reflecting it. It studied him with a tilted head, then reached out a hand, not to strike him, but to gently, almost tenderly, trace the lines of his face with fingers that felt like cold leather. "You're still warm," it murmured, its voice a grotesque parody of human speech. "That's good. They'll believe it's you." Lucas tried to scream, but only a weak, rasping noise escaped his throat. The thing smiled, revealing teeth that seemed too sharp, too many. Then, with deliberate slowness, it began to unbutton Lucas's gravedigger uniform. Horror coiled in Lucas's gut as he realized what was happening. It was taking his clothes, his identity, his life. He thrashed weakly, but the thing only chuckled, a sound like dry leaves skittering across stone, and pressed a hand against his chest, pinning him effortlessly. "Shh," it whispered. "You're almost done." One by one, it stripped him. His jacket, his shirt, his boots, until Lucas sat shivering in nothing but his underclothes, the tomb's chill seeping into his bones. The thing dressed itself in his stolen garments with unsettling precision, adjusting the collar, smoothing out the wrinkles, even pocketing his badge with a satisfied nod. Then it stood, now fully clothed as him, and looked down at Lucas with something almost like pity. "Don't worry," it said softly. "I'll take good care of everything, better than you did." Then it turned and walked toward the mausoleum door. Lucas found his voice then, a raw, broken scream that echoed off the stone walls. "Wait! What are you—" The thing paused, glancing back over its shoulder. "You know what happens next," it said simply. Then it stepped outside and shut the door behind it, plunging Lucas into total darkness. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, scraping. Something heavy being dragged across the mausoleum's entrance, a stone slab. It was sealing him in. Lucas screamed again, throwing his weakened body against the door, pounding his fists against the unyielding stone. But the scraping continued, relentless, until finally, with a terrible thud, the entrance was blocked completely. The last thing he heard was the sound of footsteps walking away, growing fainter, fainter, until there was nothing left but the dark and the cold and the dawning, horrifying realization. No one was coming to save him, because as far as the world knew, Lucas was already home. A year passed. The cemetery on the outskirts of Prague remained as it always had, quiet, forgotten, its crumbling headstones leaning like crooked teeth in the earth. The townspeople rarely visited, and when they did, they hurried through the gates with their heads down, as if afraid of catching the attention of something lurking among the graves. The old manager retired, his hands shaking too badly to hold a shovel anymore, and a new gravedigger was hired, a quiet man named Joseph, who kept to himself and didn't ask questions. He was young, but there was something in his eyes that suggested he'd seen enough of the world to know when to look away from its darker corners. On his third week, as Joseph patrolled the far edges of the cemetery where the oldest plots lay, he noticed something strange. A single, unmarked grave, its soil fresh and dark, as if it had been dug and filled only days before. No flowers adorned it, no family had come to mourn, and yet, resting atop the disturbed earth was a single, rusted watch, its cracked face still ticking faintly in the silence. Joseph crouched, frowning, and picked it up. The metal was ice cold, the leather strap brittle with age, but the hands still moved, counting down seconds that no longer mattered to whoever lay beneath. He turned it over, wiping away the grime, and froze. Engraved on the back was a name. Lucas. A chill crawled up Joseph's spine. He'd heard the stories, of course, whispers about the last gravedigger, the one who'd vanished without a trace. Some said he'd run away, unable to bear the weight of the dead anymore. Others claimed he'd drowned himself in drink, his body lost to the river. But as Joseph stared at that grave, at the watch in his palm, he knew the truth was far worse. Something had happened here. Something that didn't want to stay buried. He stood abruptly, shoving the watch into his pocket, and turned to leave. But stopped dead in his tracks. At the edge of the trees, barely visible in the fading light, stood a figure. Tall, thin, wearing a gravedigger's uniform. Joseph's breath caught. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It just watched him, with eyes that reflected too much moonlight. Then, slowly, it raised a hand and pointed, not at Joseph, but at the ground beside him, at the unmarked grave. A silent message. A warning. Joseph didn't wait to understand. He ran, his heart hammering, the watch burning a hole in his pocket like a cursed thing. Behind him, the wind picked up, rustling the leaves, carrying with it a sound that might have been laughter or weeping. He didn't look back. He knew better. But that night, as he lay in bed, the watch ticking loudly on his nightstand, he heard something outside his window. A whisper. "You'll need to dig deeper next time." And when he turned, he saw it, a face pressed against the glass, pale and grinning, its eyes black as the grave itself. The last thing Joseph noticed before the screaming started was the watch on its wrist. His watch.
Subscribe and press the bell icon so that you never miss the amazing video.